Welcome to Justice Redesign. Hey, today's guest is someone whose voice has guided leaders and institutions across the country to better understand implicit bias and racial equity. Before I take a deep dive into introducing him to you, today's episode on Justice Redesign is titled Justice Denied by Design. And so we had this conversation with Pastor Edward Palmer on implicit bias, DEI backlash, and the struggle for true equity. So let me introduce him to you. Pastor Edward Palmer Sr. is a nationally recognized certified diversity trainer, former chair of the National Coalition for Juvenile Justice, a U.S. Army veteran, recipient of numerous awards, including the Thurgood Marshall Social Justice Impact Award, the MLK Leadership Award, and the Champion of Diversity and Justice Award. His work spans child welfare, juvenile justice reform, and bias education. His implicit bias training has even been evaluated and validated by Johns Hopkins University. So we're not kidding around here when we talk about what works. Uh, when we have Johns Hopkins University, who has evaluated this and has validated it in terms of producing positive outcomes. Now, despite his decades of service, Pastor Palmer has noticed a troubling silence. Since the recent presidential administration's pushback on diversity, equity, and inclusion, known broadly as DEI, his once frequent invitations to train, guide, and consult have nearly vanished. In fact, there have been some occasions I have stood right next to him at the podium and on stage on this very issue. Okay. We both served a different purpose in terms of trying to achieve reducing racial disparities and helping people understand implicit bias. But his was a lot more targeted, more focused on addressing implicit bias and helping people understand that what is implicit bias, that it is something we all possess, regardless of the color of our skin, regardless of our background. Um, and so we're going to explore, though, this silence that he's been experiencing. What does that mean? Not just for Pastor Palmer, but for the entire justice movement. Because, when you're no longer allowed to say the word race, how can you fight racism? So let's set the stage, okay? Um, and I want to ask some questions, Pastor Palmer, regarding your mission in this regard. Now, you've dedicated your life to confronting implicit bias and reducing disproportionate minority contact in justice and child welfare systems. I'm just curious, and I'm sure these my listeners are interested. Let's lay a foundation here. What originally drew you to this mission?
Well, my friend, I'm looking at the screen and I'm seeing the difference in the shade of your skin versus my skin. And this has been a lifelong reality for me. And that is that in certain public spaces, my skin tone presents a threat to some. My skin tone presents me as suspicious to some. And so, growing up in Chicago in a working class community, it has been very clear to me that there's a difference in how kids in my community were treated in a very diverse school population versus white kids who were bused to the same school from white communities. I remember as a kid growing up in the South Side of Chicago, being stopped than my parents instead of taking the long way around to get from one black community on the south side of Chicago to another black community on the west side of Chicago. They went east, they went north, and then they went west. I decided when I got my driver's license to go the most direct route through neighborhoods that I was told by my parents not to go through. And on that first trip, I got stopped by the police. And so I grew up realizing that that was disparate treatment when it came to blacks versus whites. Another thing that draws me to this work is I've got six grandchildren, five are all African American and one biracial girl that I'm raising. I adopted at 8 months. And I know that biologically speaking, the potential of them misstepping is great because my genes are in them. They're going to push back against systems. They're going to try the boundaries, and they're going to do what adolescents do, and that is they're going to grow up testing things. So when they misstep, I want to make sure that the systems don't mishandle them. So I've got some skin in the game, if you will. And then, Judge Teskey, a lot of my work has caused me to be exposed to a lot of data around the outcomes of systems. And so I always my starting point is always, what does the data say? And so when we look at data from systems, we find that African Americans in a lot of our systems are three times more likely to experience the worst outcomes and two or three times less likely to experience the best outcomes. And so it's these kinds of statistical analysis and statistical revelations that kind of drew me to this work. And I've told my congregation, I walk away from preaching before I walk away from social justice. I believe the two are intertwined. And so you can't push me out of social justice without pushing me out of preaching, because I believe that my Lord and Savior was a DEI specialist. And I believe that if he was walking the earth today, he would probably be on the worst end of some of these DEI policies.
You know, for the younger listeners out there, I'm looking at both of us as you're describing your childhood experiences and, walking through the neighborhoods where, African American children and other kids of color were told by their parents, stay away from there. You don't want to get in trouble. Okay. They don't want you there. You know, and I'm looking at us and I'm seeing by our white hair how dated we are. And, for our younger listeners who most likely didn't witness and experience such overt discrimination, okay, does it mean that there isn't discrimination continuing today? And in some regards, in instances, still overt. But even I, as a white person in the South, uh, I recall the KKK wearing their bed sheets, out on the street corners collecting money. I remember cross burnings at a local eatery in which the owner of that eatery was the Grand Wizard of the KKK. You know, um, and there were still vestiges, where there were still remaining signs of white and Negro only. Okay, um, so uh, s- I bring that up right now because I just want my younger listeners who may already know this by reading it. It's even more impactful when you witness it and you feel it, and
Mm.
particularly when your skin color and tone is darker than mine. It bothered me as a white person. I, I could imagine what it did, okay, to people for which those type of things it was targeting and what it was telling them. So let me ask you this. So how do you approach implicit bias training? I mean, in other words, what is it that you do when you deliver implicit bias training that is effective with people and systems? And if you could start off probably defining implicit bias and then talking into how you go about helping people understand it and equipping themselves with addressing it.
All right. So one of the things I try to uh, uh, convey to folks is that we all have bias, right? It's human to favor certain things and not favor other things. It's human to like or dislike, to have preferences. And so we have those that we are very conscious of. But then there are implicit associations or responses or cognitive reactions that we have to people that we're not aware of, right? And these are shaped through pervasive attitudes and stereotypic projections of people, right? These attitudes and stereotypic projections of people start to give us these implicit responses and reactions to people. And so when you think about how the media portrays certain communities, right, it could set up in us an unconscious reaction to people who look like the people in that community. And therefore we feel threatened or we feel unsafe around certain people. And it's unconsciously happening to us. So we're unaware that we're reacting and responding to someone's skin tone or their being in a certain community after dark. So it's these attitudes and understandings that affect our emotions and our reactions to people in an unconscious manner, right? So I always tell people implicit bias is something that happens in you, it's something that happens to you, but it's not necessarily something you actively engage in. And it's possible to have implicit bias reactions to people of the same color. And so I could have them against black people in a certain neighborhood that doesn't reflect the type of neighborhood I live in. But I tell people that we can address our biases just by, there's a book out that deals with slow thinking versus fast thinking. And we can slow our thinking down and really process our reaction, right? And question our reaction and rethink what we're thinking in the moment before we react. I tell people all the time, I don't know if George Zimmerman was a racist or not, but I know at best or at worst he had a reaction to Trayvon, an implicit reaction to Trayvon Martin that said he was suspicious. Now, if he could have slowed that thinking down and asked himself why, perhaps he could have come to a different conclusion and realized that the young man was doing nothing but walking through a community, and that it was the fact that he didn't see a lot of black kids in that community um, uh, wearing hoodies that caused him to react that way. Perhaps he could have slowed his thinking down, regathered facts as to whether or not Trayvon was doing something suspicious, and perhaps Trayvon Martin would still be alive celebrating his mid 20s. So I tell folks, when you think about your implicit reactions, realize that they're just that. They're unconscious reactions based on, again, this storyline that we oftentimes see in society. But then the real heart of some of our biases stem from childhood. Our parents told us certain things about the other groups, and we grew up believing those things. We grew up reacting to those stories, and so think about what the narrative was growing up about other communities, and how they may have shaped your implicit reactions to folks from those communities, and then start to rethink how you view people. Um, and that's just a kind of a Reader Digest version of some of the training that I do on implicit bias.
You reminded me regarding when you talked about childhood. Some of the stuff that are stereotypes that are in the recesses of our mind, and we may not be so conscientious of them. Yet we are walking a life where, for many folks of my skin tone, we may see a person of color broken down the side of the road, and pull over and help them and not even think about that. But yet there may be other instances in which we're making decisions that stereotype that's still embedded in the recess of our mind may come out in a way that doesn't play so well. And it made me think about um, when uh, when I was chief parole officer in Atlanta. I was a certified instructor for the police academy, the state police academy, and they asked me if I would draft the first cultural diversity training because they were getting some issues or questions from chiefs asking, you know, is there any lesson plan on this? And I won't go into the detail, but because of things that I've been implementing in Atlanta regarding, trying to provide, diversity, equity, and inclusion going way back to the late '80s. Um, there was a participant in one of my classes from the Moultrie Police Department who I went down there, okay, to provide 2 days of training, and she's an African American female, the only one on the force, um, and she made a comment. She said, "I was in a Walmart and I went to go buy my niece uh, a baby doll, okay, and in Walmart they had mostly white dolls, but they had some you know, black baby dolls. And she was looking at them, and there was like maybe a 3, 4 year old child who's white with mama, white. And she looked over there and said, "Hey, mama, look, and used the N word, baby. Okay. Hey, mama, look, an N baby. Okay." And the mama got embarrassed, and the mama felt ashamed because she looked over and here was this police officer in uniform who's black, okay, looking for a black doll for her niece, and so she felt this need, the mother did, to say to apologize to her and said, "I'm so sorry," and then proceed to get onto her daughter. And one of the greatest things I've ever heard is that this police officer turned to the mother and says, "Please don't get onto your daughter. She's only repeating what she's heard at home." Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. And that lady would declare in my training, if she was sitting in one of my trainings, she would most likely declare at some point in the training, I'm not a racist. And yet your 3-year-old daughter already knows one of the most racist terms one could say ever. She already knows how to pronounce that word, and so it's important that we look at our upbringing and realize what it may have planted in us that we may be acting on unconsciously, and realize that the things that our parents. I grew up with parents who were raised in the 40s and 50s in rural Arkansas. They had a very negative perspective about white people. My dad was the same age as Emmett Till and remembers to this day, even as he grapples with dementia, he still remembers the day Emmett Till was murdered. And so they gave me a narrative about white people that stuck with me well into my adult age. And I had to work through some of that baggage and basically start to see people based on my own encounters with them and not through the lens that my parents gave me. But it was very difficult not to be hesitant when dealing with white people of influence based on the narrative that was planted in me. It was very traumatic to be found to be in a space alone with a white woman. I would have panic attacks on elevators and didn't know where it was coming from until I realized that my parents put this narrative in me that if white women accuse you of a crime, you're going down. There's no defense for you. You could be murdered. You could be lynched for those kinds of things. And so that fear of being in a space alone with a white woman was real for me. And it was based on that narrative. And so I had this implicit reaction that was, not consciously justifiable to me, but it happened nonetheless. So you're right.
yeah, that's a great example of implicit bias, and one that goes to show that it can go both ways. Even implicit bias doesn't discriminate itself. Okay, I mean,
Mm-mm.
I teach criminal justice studies at a college in Tucson, Arizona. It's a feeder college, University of Arizona, and in my um, so I Pima Community College asked me when the George Floyd incident happened to create a course that would be mandatory that presents where criminal justice intersects with social justice. Anyway, in that,
Mm-hmm.
one of the videos I show is the beating by Memphis police. And off the top of my head, I forgot the young man's name, but who ended up, dying in the hospital later. It was, and the video is such a it's hard to look at. It really is hard to look at. Even students, I have to warn my students, look, tell me if you need another way. If you can't do it, I will at least descriptively, and I have a word description of it, for those who can't have. That's how bad it is. But all these police officers were African American, okay? And the
Mm-hmm.
victim is African American,
Right.
and the implicit bias can can even be based upon social status, because where they were in Memphis, there could have been, well, this is a bad neighborhood. Regardless of who lives in the neighborhood, it's a bad neighborhood, so everyone's bad. Who knows? Okay. So that's a good point. But let me ask you this. You've trained systems from Washington State to DC, Princeton. Can you describe the transformation you've seen in these jurisdictions that have embraced implicit bias training?
Sure. I've had the opportunity, as you said, to train, judges, police officers, social workers, educators, mental health professionals. And when folks really embrace not just the training, but also the systemic work that I like to engage in, I see a change in their awareness to their own data. It's interesting, Judge, and you've traveled the country as I have. We've even been on the same stage, and it's interesting how people have no concept of what their data says about racial inequities in their systems. Yet every day they see this disproportionate amount of black bodies. In their courtrooms, they see a disproportionate amount of black bodies in their detention centers. They see them on their rolls of probation and parole. And yet the data, when you show them the data and that picture of what their systems look like when you compare blacks to whites, it seems like there's an awareness now that there's a problem. And so one of the things I've seen is just this overwhelming awareness to what the data says them, and they're no longer concerned about these anecdotal responses, but they want to dig into that data and find out why are there such disparities moving throughout our system. But then I see also this willingness, because we have to go beyond the data. We've been doing this work, you and I, for decades, and we go to conference after conference, and people share data with us, but very few people actually share with us work like the work you did with the School of Justice work, and how we can deconstruct these systems and rebuild and reconstruct systems with equity and inclusion built into it, recognizing the diversity of the populations that we serve. And so I see this willingness to actually look at policy through a root cause analysis lens, and talk about the policies and practices that are driving the inequitable outcomes, that are driving the disparities we see at each contact and decision point. I see this willingness to say, you know what, if we change this policy, respecting and recognizing the predisposition of this community so that they can have access to certain opportunities, just like you did in Georgia, right? If we could keep these kids in school, we could possibly increase the likelihood that they'll graduate. And that's exactly what you proved in one of the poorest communities with one of the highest graduation rates. Those two things don't go together. Poor community equals low graduation rates, and yet you showed if we would use an equity lens to figure out how to level the playing field for this group and keep them in school. Guess what? We can increase their graduation rates, and that's exactly what you proved. So I see this willingness to kind of look at the policy, and then I see this willingness to reimagine the system. You talked earlier about the police department in Memphis. We could talk about the police department and what Derek Chauvin was thinking as he kneeled on George Floyd's. There's systemic racism, and see, when racism is systemic, it doesn't matter who you hire. The system is going to carry out its racist intent. So I tell people all the time, I'm not here for you. I don't really care if you're racist, because if I can create an anti-racist system, then it will control your racist tendencies. But you can be a non-racist individual, but if I put you in a racist system, it will make you complicit with this racist intent. And a good example is, while training the Louisville Metro Police Department, police officers would tell me often that we police differently across the Metro Louisville area. And I said, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? And they would say, we have practices where if we see three black boys on the west end of Louisville standing on the street corner, we can approach them and eventually we can get into their pockets. And when we find the drugs, we arrest them. And we justify the arrest by saying they had drugs on them. But when transferred, the same officer, when transferred to the east end of Louisville, sees three white kids in the high class mall parking lot in the BMW, he's told by his training officer, don't you dare approach that car. Because pulling those kids out of that car and searching that car is going to get us a lawsuit, right? And so, if that police officer is black, the system has made him complicit in its racist intent. Treat this population one way, but don't you dare treat this population the same way. And so, I see this willingness to reimagine and reconstruct systems that consider equity as opposed to this different treatment for different populations. But then I also see this intentional approach to individualized treatment, and this is important because too often we classify people according to groups. And too often we say that community, we say that housing development, we say bad kids come from that side of town, and then we have this way of treating all of them the same. And so individualizing that care and looking for those individual traits and attributes that will connect you with that kid so that you can, assist this kid and get this kid to the best possible place. And then I see this increased willingness to have these difficult conversations. I have trained on implicit bias, avoiding cultural collisions. Let's talk race, which is this lesson that starts in 1619 and brings us through the policy development and the racist intent of policy development throughout the decades leading from slavery to where we are today. And it was difficult. People are very uncomfortable talking about race, but those jurisdictions that really bought into this idea that people are treated differently based on physical characteristics, they have this willingness to have these conversations. Co-workers are calling other co-workers, trying to get educated on how to serve a particular population that is different than themselves. And so this willingness to have these courageous conversations, and then the willingness to have conversations about the impact of the system on Black and Brown kids, and again, reimagining those policies and practices to increase the possibility of those minority populations and those disadvantaged populations achieving some of the same outcomes. You know?
Before I go on to the next question, which I'm going to shift gears a little bit, but listening to you speak right now, um, you know, reminded me of a couple things. Number one, I won't name the state, but where you and I were asked to come there, and just so you know what state it is, it's the one where you and I made our presentations in the House chambers of the Capitol. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
A very Republican state, very red state. Okay. Um, and the whole focus was on, okay, wanting to reduce disparities in their system, racial disparities, which is a great thing. And I just want to also, for my readers, understand that this is why this is not just about red versus blue and liberal versus conservative or independent or whatever the case may be. This is something that we all are equally, um, you know, afflicted with. And to that extent, there are even those on both sides of the aisle where this is really, at least before the present administration, particularly speaking of the Republican Party, they wanted help. They were asking for help, not just this state, but many jurisdictions. You and I have been there. I mean, Kentucky is, tends to lean red. Okay. Georgia tends to red, but there is some, blueness where there are moments of purpleness. But my point is that if you recall, I did, we got their data. I shared it with you. There's a lot of, I
Mm-hmm.
think in that state, there's 8 Indian reservations. Um, that it was very interesting that the order of racial disparities from the worst being against Native Indians. Okay, their youth, it was 7-1. The ratio of kids being
Mm-hmm.
arrested and detained was 7-1, Native Indian to white. Okay, um, followed by African American. I think it was 4-1, and then Hispanic, it was 3 or 2 to 1. Okay, but it was a
Hmm.
very big eye opener. We didn't show the districts, right? We didn't want to shame anybody. Going to your
Hmm.
thing, we could talk about race and make it safe, because we know if we're
Hmm.
if we're going to talk about race, it scares people, right? You know,
Hmm.
and it
Right.
doesn't have to be a scary thing. If we don't make it a scary thing, if we just understand that this is something that afflicts all of us, okay, and
Hmm.
we all really
Hmm.
want something to do it, and it goes back to your, I also have this thing. You've heard me say it. I've met, and you have too, many people across this country in juvenile justice who are very good people. They want the best for kids. Their heart
Right.
is in it,
Right.
but they still make broken decisions, not because they are individually doing it necessarily sometimes, but because you've brought up systemic issues in terms of how implicit bias can pervade, including racism can pervade in systems, that if you're
Hmm.
working in a broken
Hmm.
system, you're still going to make broken decisions no matter how good you are, no matter how well intended you are, you know? And
Hmm.
and I
Hmm.
hear you saying that. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The system controls the people. Rachel and I did co-authored article a few years ago in the Juvenile Justice Update, and I came up with the title, and the title was "Don't Hate the Player, Hate the Game," and I talked about the fact that the Michael Jordans of the NBA world will come and go. But what controls the game is not the Michael Jordans, the Larry Birds, the Hakeem Olajuwon and Magic Johnsons of the world. What controls the game are those who controls the rules. And so if they want to slow the game down, they change the rules. If they want to make the game more about the big guy in the middle, they change the rules. I look at the way the NFL kicks off the football now, right? That I think that's because of Devin Hester and the ability to run those kickoffs down. So they want to make the kickoff return less eventful. So let's make him wait until he catches the ball before everybody starts. I hate it, right? But what controls the pace of the game are not the individual players. So sometimes we're hating the player when we should be hating the game. And so you're right. I mean, if we could get folks to understand, and I think that's the problem is folks, when you start talking about race, folks start to take it personal. And they don't realize that we've all been victimized by some nefarious individual who came up with the idea that black is bad and white is good. We've all been victimized by that racial construct, right? There's nothing biological about race. Race is a social construct, right? And so if we could realize when the conversation comes up, it's not about you, it's about it. We're not trying to deconstruct you, we're trying to deconstruct the system that allows some people to carry out their ill intent. But even if they weren't racist, right? A federal guideline, a sentencing guideline, for instance, that tells you you have to sentence me a certain way for a certain amount of drugs, but that same guideline doesn't allow you to sentence somebody with a different type of cocaine to the same level of punishment. That's a system of racism. It seems like you gave me a harsher punishment than you did that person, and they had 10 times more drugs than I had. And you're like, no, the system requires that I give you this sentence. The system gives me more leeway and discretion over here. And so people look at you and go, well, that's a racist judge. No, the system that he operates in is racist. And in a lot of ways, it ties his hands on what he could or could not do in certain scenarios. So, yes, you're right. If we could get people to understand that this conversation is more about how this country was founded and how policy was shaped around the intent of the founders, and really go ahead and mention the idea of white supremacy and domination and how that has prevailed through time and through the policies of each era. Um, we could actually get folks to kind of look at this and see who's the real boogeyman in the room.
Yes, that that reminds me when back in the late 2000s, when meth started making its serious entry into the United States. Of course, it was a drug of choice for white people, right? Okay.
Mhm. Hmm.
And the governor at the time, and this is not against the governor, I mean, it's a situation, circumstance he was confronting, but he called this statewide meeting with all these counties with a delegation. I was on the delegation, but I looked at our delegation from McLean County. At this point, we had just tipped over 50% into majority African American, and since then it's grown to be, almost close to 80% African American. Okay, but at the time, it dawned on we all had enough sense to realize as we were looking around the table and all the leadership was white, and now a majority African American county. Um, you know, my former law partner, who at the time was a Superior Court judge, I'm a juvenile court judge, and we say out loud to everyone, said, I really doubt we're going to have a serious meth problem in Clayton County because the drug of choice is white and we're a minority now. Okay. But then the
Hmm.
next question was, where was all this when crack cocaine and cocaine was happening and affecting the black
Right.
community? Why weren't we having
Right.
those meetings? Okay. To deal with
Right.
that. So I just wanted to bring that up. So,
Yeah, Judge, it's interesting you should bring that up, and I hate to continue down this hole, but years ago I got to do our Chief Justice here. You met our Chief Justice, great
yes.
guy. He had these he had these opioid summits, and they had a few of them, and then they put me on the agenda to talk about disparities. And I sat in one, and I was the last speaker of the day, and I listened to all of these treatment options, and all the presenters put up nice glossy pictures of their constituents in these treatment centers, and they were all white. And so when I got up, I said, is it just me, or does it seem like when we talk about treatment and recovery, um, the population is white, but if we were talking about drug enforcement, the population would probably be all black. And then I started to talk about the historical disparities in how we approach drug epidemics in the 80s when black people were strung out on crack versus how we're dealing with this opioid drug epidemic when the primary user is white suburban moms. And now the conversation is about treatment courts. It's about, keeping them out of jail and getting them help. And there's nothing wrong with that. Had we learned and used that approach in the 80s, we probably would know how to deal with this current drug epidemic, right? And so you're 100% right. Again, systemically, how we address the same issue, right, is systemically different.
Yeah, and the thing is that again, I wanted my listeners to understand that before you might take something different about this, again, to focus on implicit bias because the governor who brought everyone together, everyone that was there, um, I mean, we wanted to really fight a bad thing. I mean, so you can't let that stop you from doing it. That's not the point. The point is that
Right.
in terms of system decision making, okay, that's how implicit bias works because those who are in control, who who happen to be the majority uh, at the time that you know that the cocaine and crack cocaine epidemic was just really seriously hurting the black community. Okay, um, you know, why is it that we weren't thinking about what can we do? Okay, to help our 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 African American families. Okay, um, so I just wanted to bring that up. Um, Well, that wraps up episode 1 of our series, Conversation with Pastor Edward Palmer on Implicit Bias, DEI Backlash and the Struggle for True Equity. We've heard Pastor Palmer reflect on his journey from his military service to his national work confronting implicit bias and the dismantling racial disparities in justice and child welfare systems. His passion, grounded in both personal and professional experience, has helped transform how institutions across the country approach equity. As we've seen, the landscape has shifted, and in our next episode, we'll dive into the anti DEI shift, silencing the language of justice. We're going to ask the hard questions. We're going to explore them with Pastor Palmer. If the current administration now argues that simply acknowledging race in policy is itself racist, How do we respond to that inversion of civil rights logic? And how can we address racism if we're no longer allowed to say the word race? And what happens on the ground when institutions are told they can't use terms like equity, inclusion, or disparities? With Pastor Palmer's nationally acclaimed expertise in implicit bias, we'll explore how this rhetoric not only undermines progress, but risks rolling it backward. Now, join us for episode 2 of Justice Redesign. And until then, keep asking questions, keep challenging the frame, and keep fighting for justice redesign. Everyone, take care.